The blood was everywhere. It soaked through Calvin Donnelly's shirt in dark, spreading blooms, staining the cracked earth beneath him a terrible rust brown, and the only sound he could hear beyond the roaring in his ears was the distant retreat of hoofbeats. The men who had ambushed him riding hard and fast into the Arizona afternoon, as if the devil himself were behind them. Except the devil was not behind them. The devil was here, lying in the dirt at the edge of a dry creek bed 6 miles outside of Redemption, Arizona, in the year of our Lord 1878, with 3 bullets in him and the absolute, bone-certain knowledge that he was not going to survive the night. He had been in tight spots before. Calvin Donnelly had survived the war, had survived the lawless years that followed, had faced down men with murder in their eyes on main streets from Texas to Nevada, and he had always walked away. Always. It was the thing people said about him, the reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. Donnelly always walks away. But lying there in the red dirt, feeling the warmth leaving his body with every labored breath, he understood with a terrible clarity that this time was different. This time, the trap had been perfectly laid, the betrayal had been complete, and the 3 men who had ridden away were the last earthly sight he expected to see. His vision was already graying at the edges. He tried to move his right hand, and the pain that screamed up through his shoulder told him that was a mistake. The bullet there had shattered something important. His left side burned with a deep, searing fire where the second shot had caught him beneath the ribs. The third wound, a graze along his temple that had knocked him senseless for what he guessed was close to an hour, had left a crust of dried blood along the entire left side of his face. He was a ruin. He knew it with the same calm certainty that he knew his own name. The sun was tilting toward the San Francisco peaks in the west, maybe 3 hours of light left. The creek bed was dry, as most of them were in late September, and there was no water to drink and no shelter from the night that would follow the blazing sunset. Wolves ran these hills after dark. Calvin Donnelly had seen their work before, and the thought of being found that way, or not found at all, was the only thing that stirred anything close to fear in him. He closed his eyes and thought, with a strange and quiet grief, of all the things he had never done. He had never settled. Had never let himself stay anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had secrets that had followed him across 3 territories, a dark past that he carried like a stone in his chest, and he had told himself for years that settling down was a luxury men like him could not afford. Now, with the light fading and his blood painting the desert floor, he understood that he had been a fool. A proud, stubborn, solitary fool. A sound reached him, soft footsteps, the scuff of boots on loose stone. Then a woman's voice, low and unhurried, with an undertone that was both sharp and calm, the voice of someone who had seen worse than this and had not run from it. "Do not move. I mean it. If you shift your weight trying to sit up, you will tear the damage wider, and then there is nothing on this earth I can do for you." Calvin Donnelly opened his eyes. She was crouching over him, blocking out the worst of the late sun, and in that first strange moment she seemed almost to be a mirage, the kind the desert manufactured to torment the dying. But she was not a mirage. She was entirely, undeniably real, with dark eyes that were cataloging his wounds with the same quick, analytical precision that Calvin had seen in army surgeons, men who had spent years training to assess exactly this kind of damage. Her hands were already moving, pressing cloth against the wound at his side, and the pressure was firm and absolutely confident, not the tentative touch of someone who was guessing at what to do, but the certain touch of someone who knew. "You are going to live," she said, and the way she said it was not a comfort. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone one might use to report the weather. "But not if you keep bleeding at this rate. How long have you been down?" He tried to speak and produce something between a cough and a groan. She glanced at his face, assessed the dried blood, and answered her own question. "An hour, maybe more, all right." She reached into the large canvas bag slung over her shoulder and began pulling things out with practiced efficiency. small paper packets and clay jars and rolled strips of clean linen that smelled faintly of something he could not name, something green and medicinal and ancient. My name is Martha Monroe. I am not going to apologize for the pain that is coming, because you need to understand exactly what is happening to your body, and that requires you to stay conscious. Calvin Donnelly, who had been absolutely certain he was finished, stared up at the woman kneeling in the dirt beside him and felt, beneath the agony and the fading light, the faintest and most inexplicable flicker of something that might, in other circumstances, have been called hope. He had arrived in Redemption, Arizona, 6 weeks earlier, riding in from the northeast on a horse that was as trail-worn as he was. The town had that look common to settlements in the Arizona Territory in those years, raw and provisional, as though it had not quite decided whether it intended to stay. The main street was unpaved and rutted deep by wagon wheels, and the buildings that lined it ranged from solid timber-framed structures to walls of stacked adobe brick to simple canvas awnings stretched over wooden frames. There was a general store, a post office that shared space with a telegraph office, a saloon called the Lucky Prospect that did reasonable business, a livery, a small church of uncertain denomination, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings fanning out from the main thoroughfare. The Marshal of Redemption was a heavy-set, slow-spoken man named Elias Prout, who had put out word through the territorial network that he needed a temporary deputy. His regular deputy had broken 2 ribs and a wrist in a riding accident and would be laid up for the better part of 2 months. Prout had enemies he was watching closely, a situation developing between 2 competing cattle concerns that had already produced 1 dead cowhand and a burned haystack, and he wanted another capable gun in town while he navigated the politics of it. Calvin had gotten word of the posting from a contact in Flagstaff, and had ridden in with no particular intention of staying beyond the immediate need. He had been between situations for 3 months, drifting in the way he sometimes did when the weight of his own history became too heavy to carry in any one place. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a square jaw shadowed always by dark stubble no matter how recently he had shaved, and eyes of a particular dark gray that people sometimes found unsettling because they gave away nothing. He had fought in the war on the Union side, had worked as a range detective for several years after, and had come to his current occupation by a route that was neither simple nor entirely clean. He had done things he was not proud of. The dark past he carried was not imaginary or metaphorical. There were specific events, specific failures and choices that had shaped him into the closed, careful man he was now. He had gone first to the marshal's office, presented his credentials, and been hired on the spot. Then he had gone to the livery to stable his horse, and it was there that he had first heard the name Martha Monroe. The livery owner was a wiry man named Cassius Webb, who was the kind of person who talked continuously while working, narrating his own actions and observations in an unbroken stream. He told Calvin about the cattle situation while checking the horse's shoes, told him about the history of the Lucky Prospect's current owners while filling the water trough, and then, with the apparent randomness of a mind that followed its own associations, said, "You will want to know about Martha Monroe if you are going to be working for Prout." Calvin had asked why. "Because half the people in this town have some business with her at one time or another, and Prout does too, though he does not always admit it," Cassius said, picking up a curry brush. "She lives about 1.5 miles out east of town, past the second bend in the creek. Has a piece of land there she works herself, grows things, makes things, medicines and such, the kind that work when the other kind does not." "A doctor?" Calvin asked. Cassius made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Not a doctor, nothing like that. She learned from her grandmother, who was half Cherokee, and her grandmother learned from her grandmother before that. Martha knows plants the way some men know cattle, down to the bone. She can tell you what grows where and why, what cures what kills what, and she is never wrong about it. Doc Hennessy, the actual physician we have. He does not always admit it, but there have been cases where she stepped in and did what he could not." "And Prout has business with her?" Calvin asked. "Her land sits on the edge of property that Randolph Holt is trying to acquire. Holt is one of the cattlemen whose business you will be getting yourself mixed up in. He has been after her parcel for 2 years. She has not sold and she is not going to sell, and that makes her a complication in Holt's plans." Cassius set down the brush and looked at Calvin directly. "She is not a woman who needs protection. I want to be clear about that. She has managed this situation on her own, and she will continue to manage it. But you being in town means you will encounter it, so I am telling you the shape of things." Calvin had absorbed this information and filed it away. He had his job to do. He was not in redemption to involve himself in land disputes or to become acquainted with women who made medicines from plants. He was there to keep the peace, collect his temporary pay, and move on. He had managed to stick to this intention for exactly 11 days. On the 12th day, a Thursday in mid-August, Marshal Prout had asked him to ride out to the Monroe property to deliver a document, a formal legal notice from the county surveyor's office that needed a witness signature. Prout himself was occupied with a situation at the Lucky Prospect involving a cheating accusation and a knife that had been drawn but not yet used, and he could not leave. Calvin had ridden out in the early afternoon, following Cassius Webb's directions, and had found the Monroe property with no difficulty. It was perhaps 15 acres in total, more than he had expected, with a solid adobe house set back from the road and a substantial garden that occupied nearly half an acre behind it. Even from a distance, the garden was extraordinary, and Calvin, who had grown up on farmland in Ohio before the war and knew something about what a well-tended piece of earth looked like, felt the first involuntary spark of genuine curiosity. He had never seen so many varieties of plant growing in such close organization, each section carefully bordered, with small wooden stakes he could see even from the fence line. He had dismounted, tied his horse, and approached the house. Before he could knock, a voice came from the far side of the garden. "I am here, come around." He walked around the side of the house and through a gate in a low fence, and found Martha Monroe kneeling in the earth between 2 rows of plants, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands dark with soil, examining the underside of a large leaf with the focused attention of a watchmaker examining a mechanism. She was perhaps 28 years old, tall for a woman, with a straight, unbowed posture that was distinctive even when she was crouched in the dirt. Her hair was dark brown, thick, and pinned at the back of her neck in a practical arrangement that had come partly loose from the morning's work. Her face was striking in a way that took a moment to understand, not conventionally pretty by the narrow standards the fashion magazines described, but strong-featured and intelligent and entirely self-possessed. She looked up at him with those dark eyes, and he had the immediate disconcerting sensation of being assessed with complete accuracy. "Calvin Donnelly," she said, "Prout's new deputy." "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim, "I have a document from the surveyor's office. I know what it is." She stood, brushed the soil from her hands with businesslike efficiency, and came toward him. She did not take the document immediately, but looked at him for a moment longer in that assessing way, as though checking her first impression against a second reading. "You have been in town 11 days, she said. "You eat at the Lucky Prospect 3 nights a week, and at the boarding house the other nights. You take your horse out for an hour before sunrise each morning. You are not from here originally, which I suspect you share with most of this town's population, and you are not planning to stay." She took the document from his extended hand. "None of those are criticisms, they are simply observations." Calvin stared at her. He had not said a word beyond his name and his reason for being there. "How?" he said, and then stopped, because he was not entirely sure how to finish the question. Something at the corner of her mouth shifted fractionally. It was not quite a smile. "You have dust on your boots from the East Road exclusively, not from the main street, which means you are not spending your evenings walking the town. Your hat has a sweat line consistent with early morning rides in this heat, too low for midday work. Your accent carries Ohio, which is not common here, and men who intend to stay put down more personal markers. You have none." She glanced at the document. "I will need to read this before I sign it." He had stood there in her garden for the next 20 minutes while she read the surveyor's document with complete concentration, occasionally making a small noise of recognition or displeasure, and he had found himself looking at the garden around him with new attention. The organization he had sensed from a distance was, up close, even more remarkable. The beds were laid out with what he gradually understood was a complex logic grouping plants not just by type, but by their relationship to each other. What he would later learn was called companion planting, where certain plants supported or protected their neighbors. The wooden stakes carried small handwritten labels in a tight, precise script, giving the botanical name alongside what he would have called the common name. There were plants he recognized, sage and chamomile and yarrow, and dozens he had never encountered before, low-growing things with silver leaves, tall stalked plants with tiny clustered flowers, dense ground covers with a sharp, clean scent. "This document is not legally binding as written," Martha said eventually, looking up. "It cites a boundary marker that does not exist as described. Either the surveyor made an error, which is possible but not probable given that this is the third such document in 2 years, or someone has been deliberately misrepresenting the boundaries to inch the line toward my land." She looked at Calvin with those direct eyes. "You can tell Prout that I will not sign it, and that I would like him to request the original survey map from the territorial office in Prescott before any further documents of this nature are sent to me." Calvin, who had come expecting to spend 5 minutes delivering a piece of paper and return to town, found himself saying, "I can look into it." Martha Monroe looked at him for a moment. "That is not your job as deputy." "No," he agreed, "but it is the kind of thing that becomes my job when it turns into a conflict." There was a pause in which she seemed to be genuinely reconsidering her first assessment of him. "There are lemonade and ginger biscuits on the table inside," she said then. "I made them this morning. If you want to discuss what you know about Holt's operation, I will tell you what I know about the boundary situation. It is probably worth both our times." He had stayed for 2 hours. It was the first of what became, over the following weeks, a series of conversations that neither of them had planned or officially acknowledged as anything in particular. Calvin was professional about it in the way he was professional about everything, not giving himself permission to think about it directly, keeping it in the category of useful intelligence gathering. Martha was, if anything, even more disciplined about it. She was not a woman who made herself available to scrutiny, and she had, he gathered gradually, good reasons for her independence that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with wisdom accumulated through specific experience. She told him, in pieces and not in any confessional way but simply as relevant background, that she had been married briefly at 19, to a man who had seemed reasonable and turned out to be neither. She had left him after 14 months, which in 1869 had required a level of determination and clarity of purpose that most people around her had found incomprehensible. Her husband had not been violent in the obvious way, but he had systematically and deliberately worked to undermine her knowledge, her work, her sense of her own judgment, and she had recognized what it was and ended it before it finished its work on her. She had come west with her grandmother's seed collection, her grandmother's notebooks, and a single-mindedness that had served her completely well. She had built her life here with intention. Every plant in that garden was there because she had decided it should be. Every remedy in the clay jars on her shelves represented accumulated knowledge tested against real outcomes, not tradition for tradition's sake but genuine, observed, documented results. She kept a notebook herself now, recording what she used and in what doses and to what effect, cross-referencing with her grandmother's records and with what botanical literature she could obtain. And it was this combination of indigenous knowledge and her own rigorous empirical observation that made her work so effective. Doc Hennessy, the town's actual physician, was a trained man and not incompetent, but he was also limited by a formal medical education that, in 1878, still had significant gaps, particularly regarding remedies for infection, for fever, for the kinds of chronic conditions that were the daily reality of frontier life. Martha had, on 3 separate occasions that Calvin knew of, solved problems that Hennessy had failed to resolve, and on the most recent of those occasions, she had prevented a child's death from a septic wound by preparing a poultice from plants in her garden whose antibacterial properties she could describe with precision, though she did not use that word. Calvin had asked her once, sitting on the step of her house in the golden late afternoon light of early September, how she knew when a remedy was working and when it was not. She had looked at him with that expression he was coming to know well, the one that preceded an answer she genuinely cared about giving. "You watch," she said. "You observe the patient, the symptom, the progression. You record the variables. You adjust. It is not mystical and it is not simple faith. It is the same process of logic and observation that anyone uses when they are genuinely trying to understand something, rather than trying to prove a point." She paused. People often want remedies to be mysterious because it makes them feel better about not understanding them. I find that tedious. Understanding is always better than mystery. "Even when the thing you are understanding is terrible?" he asked. She had looked at him for a longer moment than usual, and in the look was the question of what he was referring to, the personal weight of it. "Especially then," she said quietly. "Mystery lets you avoid. Understanding lets you move." He had thought about that for a long time. The trouble with Randolph Holt had been escalating steadily through September. Holt was a man in his mid-40s who had arrived in the territory 4 years earlier with Eastern money and Western ambitions, and who had spent those 4 years systematically acquiring land through means that ranged from legitimate purchase to deliberate pressure to outright intimidation. He was not stupid, and he was not crude about it. He operated through intermediaries and legal mechanisms and the occasional strategic use of false information, and he had managed in 4 years to accumulate a cattle operation that represented a significant economic presence in the region. Martha's 15 acres were not important to Holt for their agricultural value. They were important because they sat at the corner of 2 parcels he wanted to connect, and without them, the water rights to the Lower Creek section were complicated in ways that his lawyers could not resolve cleanly. He had offered to buy the land 3 times at prices that were, by any objective measure, fair. Martha had declined 3 times, citing not the price but the fact that she had no interest in leaving a place she had built, and a practice she had established, and a garden that represented 15 years of accumulated work. The 4th approach had involved the falsified boundary documents, an attempt to make it appear legally that her land was smaller than it was, and that certain portions of it were already in disputed territory. Calvin had begun investigating this in his unofficial capacity, writing to the Territorial Surveying Office himself and asking questions through Pruitt's official channel, and in early September he had received a response that confirmed Martha's reading of the document. The boundary description cited a marker that had been placed after the fact and did not appear in the original survey record. This was, at minimum, a significant legal irregularity. At maximum, it was fraud. He had told Martha, and she had listened with the focused, contained expression she wore when she was processing important information. She had then said, "This means the next move will not be legal." "That is my assessment also," Calvin said. "How do you know what their next move will look like?" "Because I know Holt's type," Calvin said, and in his voice was something harder and more specific than professional judgment, something that was personal in the way his dark past was personal. He had worked for men like Holt before, in another life, in the years after the war when he had made choices he was not proud of. He had been the instrument of exactly this kind of pressure, not the architect but the enforcement, the man sent to make situations uncomfortable for people who would not accommodate the interests of those with more power. He had stopped doing that work after a specific incident he did not talk about, and he had spent the years since then on the other side of the equation, but he knew the methodology from the inside. Martha had been watching him while he said this, and she had understood something of what was behind the words without requiring him to explain it. She was very good at that. "So we prepare," she said. "You may want to consider spending some time in town," Calvin said carefully. She had looked at him with precisely the expression he had expected. "I am not going to abandon my home and my work because Holt wants me to be uncomfortable," she said. "If that is your suggestion, you have misjudged my character considerably." "It was not a suggestion," he said. "It was an option I was required to mention. I knew what you would say." Something had shifted then, a small change in her expression that was warmer than anything she had shown him before, and he had felt it in his chest with a clarity that was both startling and, he was beginning to understand, inevitable. The ambush had been set for him specifically. He understood this in retrospect, though in the moment leading up to it, he had believed he was following a legitimate lead. A man named Garrett, who worked as a hand for one of the smaller ranches, had sent word to the marshal's office that he had information about Holt's land operation and wanted to share it, but only with the deputy, not the marshal, because he did not trust that Prout was not in Holt's pocket. Calvin had agreed to meet him at a location Garrett specified, an old mining claim at the edge of a dry creek bed 6 miles east of town. Garrett had not been there when Calvin arrived. 3 men had been. He had recognized 2 of them, had seen them around town in Holt's company, and had reached for his gun with the speed that had kept him alive through worse situations than this. But the 3rd man had been behind him, already mounted on high ground, and the first shot had taken his shoulder before he cleared leather, and everything after that had happened very fast and very badly. He had fought them until the second bullet found his side, and the blood loss and the head wound had put him in the dirt. They had ridden away, he thought, because they believed him dead or close enough to leave. They had been correct in their assessment of his condition. They had been wrong about what would happen next. Martha Monroe had been returning from the eastern hills where she collected certain plants that grew only in the rocky, elevated terrain above the creek bed, plants she used in preparations for joint pain and inflammation that she could not source closer to home. She made this walk once a month, always in the cooler part of the day, always with her canvas bag and her notebook, cataloging as she went. She had heard the distant crack of gunshots, had identified from the echo and timing that they were coming from the old Peabody claim, and had considered her options for less than 30 seconds before changing her direction and moving toward the sound. She had found Calvin in the red dirt and had done immediately what needed to be done, which was to stop the bleeding, assess the severity, and make a determination about transport. He was too heavy and too badly wounded to move far, but she could not treat him adequately in the open with the light dying, and there was a weathered prospector's shelter 40 yards further up the creek bank, 3 walls and most of a roof, which was better than nothing. She had stabilized the shoulder wound and the side wound with pressure packing from her kit, cleaned the head wound, and then done something Calvin had not expected. She had said, with complete calm, "I need you to move." "I know that sounds impossible. It is not. I have done the arithmetic on your blood loss and your remaining strength, and if we move in the next 10 minutes with me supporting you, you can make it to the shelter. If we wait for your strength to return, it will not return enough before dark, so we go now." He had, largely because her voice contained no room for any alternative, gotten up. It had been one of the most painful and exhausting things he had ever done, and he had done some considerable things. She took most of his weight on her left side, and she was stronger than she looked, or perhaps she was exactly as strong as she looked if you were actually paying attention. They made the 40 yards in what felt like an hour but was probably less than 5 minutes, and he had collapsed against the shelter wall while she arranged her kit and began working. The next 2 hours were something Calvin would remember for the rest of his life, not because of the pain, though there was significant pain, but because of the specific character of what Martha Monroe did while she worked. She talked. Not to distract him, or not primarily to distract him, but because she believed that understanding what was happening to his body was both his right and practically useful in keeping him conscious and cooperative. She explained what each wound had done and what she was doing about it, using anatomical terms she was clearly comfortable with, crossing between the language of her grandmother's knowledge and her own observed understanding with a fluency that was extraordinary. The shoulder wound had not hit bone, a piece of fortune she described as significant. The bullet had passed through the muscle, and she could feel with her fingers that the exit wound was clean. She packed it with a preparation she made on the spot, warming dried yarrow and plantain leaf in a tin cup over the small fire she had built, reducing it to a dense poultice that she applied with careful, even pressure. The effect on the bleeding was, even to Calvin's pain-fogged observation, remarkable. The flow slowed within minutes to something she was willing to work with. The side wound was more serious. The bullet had not exited. She examined it with her fingers and a thin steel probe she carried, and her face was composed and focused, the expression of someone doing a calculation. "It is sitting against a rib," she said. "It has not penetrated the chest cavity. I can feel that from your breathing, which is painful but not the specific kind of painful that means a lung is involved." She looked up at him. "The bullet needs to come out. I can do it. I have done it before twice. The tools I have are adequate if you can stay still." Calvin had looked at her in the firelight, at those dark eyes that were absolutely steady and absolutely certain, and he had felt something shift in him that had nothing to do with the medical situation. "All right," he said. "I will use a preparation first that will take the edge off the pain," she said. "I am not going to tell you it will take all of it because it will not, but it will make the difference between manageable and not." She was already preparing the dose, a carefully measured amount of something from one of her small jars, dissolved in the tin cup with water from her canteen. "Willow bark and valerian with a specific addition. Do not ask me to explain all of it now. The proportions matter and I know them." He drank what she gave him. It was deeply bitter and astringent, and within 20 minutes he felt the edge of the pain recede, not disappear but step back to a distance he could work with. The removal of the bullet was something he endured by focusing on her hands, which did not shake. Not once. She worked by firelight with a pair of narrow steel forceps, her other hand braced against his side to feel what her eyes could not entirely see, and she talked him through every step, not apologetically but factually, telling him what she was doing and why. When it was over and the bullet was in the dirt and she was packing and binding the wound with the clean linen from her bag, he felt something that was not simply gratitude for being alive. He felt something much larger and harder to articulate, a shaking loose of something in his chest that had been locked there for a very long time. "You have done this before," he said again, because it kept striking him. "I told you twice," she said, not looking up from the bandage she was tying. "The first time was a Navajo man who had been shot by soldiers in a situation that should not have occurred, but did because the injustice of this territory's management of its native people is consistent and ongoing." Her voice was even, but there was iron in it. "The second time was a cowhand who got caught between the two Holt crews in an argument over a water trough 3 months ago. He survived. He is back working cattle now." She finished the knot and sat back on her heels. "You should also survive if you do not develop infection and if you rest as directed." "And if I develop infection," Calvin said. "Then we will address that when it comes," she said. She finally looked at him. "I have preparations for that as well." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the firelight. She had blood on her forearms and a smudge of it on her cheek, and her hair had come entirely loose from its pin, and she was sitting in a broken-down prospector's shelter with no particular expression beyond the careful, considering one she usually wore. She was the most remarkable human being he had encountered in his entire life, and he was certain of this with the same cold clarity that he had been certain, an hour ago, that he was dying. "Martha," he said, and then stopped, because he was not sure what he intended to say. "Rest," she said simply. "We can talk when you are not actively losing blood." He slept. He woke in the gray pre-dawn with a fire still burning low and Martha sitting opposite him, her notebook open on her knee, writing in that small, precise script of hers by firelight. She was recording, he understood, everything she had done. Every preparation, every decision, every observation. This was how she built knowledge. This was how she made sure that what worked for him tonight would be available to the next person who needed it. He watched her for a long moment before she noticed he was awake. And in that unguarded moment, he felt the full weight of what he was feeling. The thing he had been managing and containing and refusing to name for the past 6 weeks. It was not simple attraction, though she was someone he found deeply attractive in the specific way that intelligence and certainty and physical competence combine into something that reaches a man more deeply than conventional beauty. It was not simple gratitude, though he was alive because of her, and that fact had a weight he could feel in every breath. It was something that had been building since the afternoon in her garden, since the lemonade and the surveyor's document and the careful, precise way she had said, "Understanding lets you move." He was in love with her. He acknowledged it to himself with the same flat, honest recognition he had given to the fact of his own near death. It was true, and it was inconvenient, and it was probably, given the kind of man he was and the kind of life he had built, a situation that was going to require some very careful navigation. Martha looked up then and saw him watching her. She held his gaze for a moment with that assessing expression, and then she said, "How is the pain?" "Present," he said. "Manageable." She came over and checked the bindings with her hands, pressed carefully around the side wound, and he breathed through it steadily. "Swelling is where I expected it to be," she said. "No sign of infection beginning, which is the best news we could have right now. The poultice needs to be changed in an hour." She sat back. "We need to get you to my house today. The shelter will not serve beyond another night, and you need a full week of rest and proper treatment." "I need to get back to town," Calvin said. "Holt's men will have reported back to him by now, and if he believes I am dead, that is either a problem or an opportunity, and Prout needs to know what happened." "You cannot ride," Martha said with finality. "I have ridden with worse." She looked at him. "No," she said quietly, "you have not. You have a bullet wound in your side that I have just closed and packed, and a shoulder injury that will reopen under the strain of managing a horse. I have explained the medical reality. I am not asking you to agree with it because it suits me. I am telling you what is true." A pause. "However, you can send a message. I have paper and a pencil. You can write what Prout needs to know, and I will take it to town myself this morning while you rest. I need to be in town anyway. I need additional supplies." Calvin looked at her. The logic was inarguable. The practical capability was obvious. He was, in this moment, in her care, and the decision of a man of his habitual independence to accept that fact fully and without resistance was its own kind of revelation. "All right," he said. "Thank you." She handed him the notebook and pencil without comment. He wrote Prout a full account, 2 pages in his own tight script, telling him everything about the ambush and the 3 men he had identified and what it meant for the Holt situation. He gave it to Martha, who folded it precisely and put it in her bag, and then went about changing his dressings with the efficient tenderness that was entirely characteristic of how she did everything, absolutely focused, absolutely competent, with a quality beneath the competence that was not sentimentality but was care, genuine and direct. "Martha," he said while she was working. "Yes. Last night, before you found me." He stopped, organizing the words. "I had decided I was finished. Not in the sense of panic, in the sense of certainty. I had assessed the situation and concluded that there was no path forward." She was quiet, listening, her hands continuing their work. "You changed that," he said. "Not just practically. I mean that you changed something about the conclusion I had reached." She looked up at him. "Because I arrived in time," she said carefully. "Because of what you did when you arrived," he said. "Because of how you did it, because of who you are." He held her gaze. I am telling you this because I believe you value directness, and because I have spent too long not saying the true thing to people who deserve to hear it." Martha Monroe looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was, for once, not the assessing one, not the clinical one, not the focused at work one. It was something more open and more careful at the same time, the expression of someone who had built good walls and was deciding, consciously and with full awareness of what they were doing, to acknowledge the gate in them. "I value directness," she confirmed. "I also value not making decisions based on acute circumstances, because acute circumstances distort judgment." She finished the knot in the bandage. "Rest now. We will talk when you are not days removed from almost dying, because you are not in a position to assess your own judgment accurately right now, and neither am I, but I have heard you." She left for town and returned by mid-afternoon with supplies and with Pruitt himself, who had ridden out to see for himself the state of his deputy and to understand the full shape of the situation. Pruitt was a man who processed information slowly and thoroughly, and he sat in the entrance of the shelter for an hour listening to Calvin's full account and Martha's medical assessment of his condition. And when he was done, he said, in his slow, deliberate way, that he was going to wire the territorial marshal in Prescott, and that Holt was going to have a very difficult month ahead of him. "The 3 men from the ambush," Calvin said. "2 of them I can identify by name." "I know who they are," Pruitt said. "Been watching them for 3 weeks." He stood. "You rest. Miss Monroe is right that you need a week, and a week is what I am giving you because I cannot afford to have you useless to me when this situation comes to a head." He looked at Martha. "Thank you," he said, simply and sincerely, "for what you did last night." Martha said, "Bring the territorial documentation I requested when you come next time. The water rights question is separate from the ambush, but they are part of the same pattern of behavior, and I want everything in order." Pruitt said he would. He rode back to town. And Calvin Donnelly, entirely against his will and his habits and his long practice of managing his own vulnerability, submitted to being cared for. Martha's house was everything the 30 seconds of approach had suggested it would be. She moved him there the next morning, walking him slowly with her shoulder under his good arm, and he spent the first 3 days in the spare room off the main living area, which was a small, clean, whitewashed space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the side of the garden. The light through that window changed through the day in the specific way of desert light, sharp and gold in the morning, white and merciless at noon, amber and full of shadow in the late afternoon, and Calvin found himself watching it with an attention he did not usually give to such things, because there was very little else he could do. Martha checked on him every 4 hours with the precision of a clock, bringing the medicines and the fresh dressings and the food, which was plain and nourishing and good. Beans and corn bread in the early days when his appetite was unreliable, and then, as the week progressed and his strength began returning, more substantial things, stews with vegetables from the garden, eggs from the 6 chickens that lived in a small pen beside the house, dried fruit and hard cheese that she had laid in with the same forward-thinking organization she applied to everything else. She did not coddle him, and she did not hover, and she did not fill the silences with unnecessary talk, which suited him completely. What she did do was sit with him in the evenings, sometimes reading from one of the several books she owned, sometimes writing in her notebook, sometimes simply sitting on the chair near the window with a cup of tea and existing in the same space as him. And in those evenings, Calvin felt something settle in him that had not settled in 34 years. A quality of rest that was not simply the absence of activity, but something more like peace. On the 4th day, he asked her about her grandmother. She talked for an hour, which was longer than he had heard her talk about any single subject. And in the talking she became more animated than her usual contained self, her hands moving, her face opening into expressions of warmth and grief and humor that he was collecting the way a man collects things he knows are rare. Her grandmother had been born in the Cherokee Nation in Georgia, and had survived the forced removals of the 1830s as a young child, had carried her knowledge west as the only inheritance that could not be taken from her, had rebuilt what she knew in new soil and new country with the relentless, bone-deep adaptability of a woman who understood that knowledge was power of the specific kind that could not be confiscated. She had passed all of it to Martha's mother, who had passed it to Martha, each generation adding and testing and refining. She kept notes from the very beginning, Martha said, with an expression that was pure love, even in the years when writing them down was not safe. She used her own shorthand, a system she devised herself. I grew up learning to read it. The injustice of what happened to her and her people, Calvin said, and it was not a question, is not separate from the injustice of what is happening to native peoples in this territory right now, Martha said, with that iron in her voice again. The patterns are the same. The justifications are the same. The only difference is the scale of the current machinery and the fact that people who should know better are choosing not to look. She was quiet for a moment. My grandmother would say that the land remembers everything. I am not certain about the metaphysics of that, but I believe the principle is correct. On the fifth day, Calvin told her about his dark past. He had not planned to. He was not in the habit of confession, and he was not doing it for absolution. He did it because it was the true thing, and because she had given him, over these 5 days, a specific and particular quality of presence that made truth feel both possible and necessary. He told her about the years after the war when he had worked as enforcement for a land acquisition operation in Kansas, doing the kind of pressure and intimidation work that was identical in its methods to what Holt was doing here. And he told her about the specific incident that had ended it. A family he had been sent to frighten off their land, a woman not unlike Martha in her refusal to be intimidated. And what had happened when the men he was working for decided that frightening was not enough. He had not participated in what followed, but he had not prevented it either, and the weight of that specific failure had been the stone in his chest ever since. Martha listened without interrupting, with her hands still in her lap and her eyes on him, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "You have been punishing yourself for it," she said. "Not a question." "Carrying it," he said. "I have not allowed myself to stay anywhere or build anything because I told myself men who had done what I had done did not deserve those things." "That is a logic that only produces more waste," she said, in her direct way. "The family who was harmed is not helped by your continued isolation. The debt, such as it is not paid by self-denial. If you wanted to address it, you would need to do something constructive, and you appear to have spent the subsequent years doing exactly that, working law enforcement, working against exactly the kind of operation you were once part of." She paused. "I am not dismissing the gravity of it. I am saying that the sentence you have imposed on yourself is neither just nor useful." Calvin looked at her for a moment. "Understanding lets you move," he said. She held his gaze, and something passed between them that was both recognition and, very quietly, the beginning of a mutual acknowledgement of something that had been growing for weeks. "Yes," she said. On the 6th day, she let him sit in the garden for the afternoon, which was, given the quality of the afternoon, one of the finest things he could remember experiencing in years. The September light was soft and golden. The garden was full of sound, birds and insects and the quiet creak of the wooden stakes in a light breeze, and Martha worked around him, pruning and checking and making small notes in her notebook, occasionally explaining without being asked what she was doing and why. He sat and listened and watched, and felt his body slowly reassembling itself around the healing that her work had initiated. "Tell me what this one is," he said, pointing to a plant near his chair, a low-growing thing with gray-green leaves and tiny purple flowers. She named it, gave him the botanical Latin, told him what it was for, and then did the same for the next plant he pointed to, and the next, and it became a kind of game that they played through the afternoon, him pointing and her explaining. And beneath the game was a communication that was not about plants at all, but was about the giving and receiving of knowledge between two people who had decided, without formally deciding it, that they were going to share their lives. On the seventh day, Prout came back with the territorial documentation Martha had requested and with news. 3 of Holt's men had been arrested, including the 2 Calvin had identified from the ambush. A territorial marshal had arrived from Prescott and was formally investigating Holt's land operation. The survey irregularities Martha had identified had been found, on investigation, to be part of a systematic pattern of document fraud across 4 separate property acquisitions. Holt himself is likely to be looking at federal charges, Prout said, sitting at Martha's table with a cup of her coffee, which he accepted with a gratitude that suggested he had tried it before and knew what a privilege it was. His operation in this part of the territory is finished. Whether he personally goes to prison will depend on the territorial prosecutor, but his land ambitions here are done. Martha looked at the documentation Prout had brought, went through it with her usual focused speed, and then set it down with the expression of someone tying off the last thread of a problem. "The boundary survey is corrected," she said, "and the water rights documentation is clear." "Your land is your land," Prout said. "Always was. Now it is on paper correctly." Calvin watched Martha absorb this, watched her face move through the contained but genuine satisfaction of a specific justice achieved through her own intelligence and her own refusal to be moved. He felt a pride in her that was both personal and fierce, the pride of a man who had encountered someone truly exceptional and had the intelligence to know it. Prout looked between them with the slow, observant eyes of a man who noticed things and filed them correctly, and said nothing about them until appropriate. He finished his coffee, thanked Martha for it and for everything else, reminded Calvin that his deputy position was formally extended for another 2 months if he wanted it, and rode back to town. In the quiet that followed, Calvin stood up from the table, which he was able to do now without assistance and with only moderate pain, and walked to where Martha was standing by the window looking out at the garden. "I want to stay," he said. She turned and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "Not as deputy," he said, "or not only as deputy. I want to stay in redemption. I want to build something here. I have been moving for a long time because I believed I had no right to stop, and you have comprehensively dismantled that belief." He paused. "I am not asking you to decide anything right now. I know that is not how you work, and it is not how I work either, and I am also aware that I said I would not press this until I was no longer in the immediate aftermath of nearly dying, so I have waited a week." Martha was quiet for a moment. "You have waited 7 days," she said. "I thought the instruction was a week." "A week is 7 days," she said, and there was something in her voice that was, unmistakably, amusement, the warm, dry kind that was deeply characteristic of her. "Then I have followed instructions exactly," he said. She looked at him for another moment and then she said, "I have been alone by choice for 9 years, not for lack of opportunity, for lack of anyone who saw what I was and valued it rather than being threatened by it." She held his gaze. "You are not threatened by what I am." "No," he said simply. "I am in awe of what you are." She stepped toward him and took his hand, the good hand on the side away from the shoulder wound, and held it with the same steady certainty with which she did everything, and Calvin Donnelly felt the stone in his chest dissolve away into nothing. "Stay," she said. "We will work out the details." The weeks that followed were, Calvin would later say, the closest to happy he had known. He was, by the letter of his arrangement, still deputy marshal, and he performed that work conscientiously, and with the particular effectiveness of a man who now had a specific investment in the stability and safety of the community he was working in. The Holt situation wound down through October and into November, the federal investigation proceeding with the slow grind of territorial justice, several of Holt's lieutenants ultimately pleading guilty to various charges, and Holt himself facing a trial that was scheduled for the spring term. Calvin moved his few possessions from the boarding house and took a room at the Lucky Prospect while Prout's regular deputy returned to duty, and the question of the permanent deputyship was settled. He spent his evenings, most of them at Martha's. He helped in the garden as his shoulder healed, learning the names of things and the logic of their arrangement, becoming a student of her knowledge with a willingness and attention that she found, he could tell, both unexpected and deeply pleasing. He was not a man who pretended competence. He did not have, or who treated being a student as diminishing. He had spent his life learning what he needed to know, and learning from Martha Monroe was among the most valuable educations he had ever received. She taught him to make the yarrow and plant in poultice. She taught him to identify the plants in the rocky hills above the creek where she collected. She gave him one of her grandmother's notebooks to read, the one that dealt with the plants common to this particular region of the territory, and he read it with the attention it deserved, asking questions and writing his own notes in the margins with her permission, the beginning of a collaborative record that would eventually become something important in its own right. In November, on a cold, clear evening with the first frost of the year making the garden sparkle in the lamplight from the window, Calvin asked her to marry him. He did not do it with elaborate ceremony or dramatic declaration. He did it with the same directness she had taught him to value, sitting at her table after supper with his hands around a coffee cup and his eyes on her face, saying that he intended to make Redemption his permanent home, and that he wanted her to know that his staying was not contingent on her answer, but that the specific form of the life he was imagining required her particular presence in it. She had listened to this with her characteristic expression of focused attention and then said, "Are you certain? About which part? About staying, not about me. I am relatively confident about me," she said with that dry warmth. "But about staying, about putting down roots in one place. You have been moving for a long time, and I need to know that this is a genuine decision and not a reaction to acute circumstances, because you made the very reasonable point yourself that acute circumstances distort judgment." He had looked at her for a long moment. "3 months ago," he said, "I told you that I had been moving because I did not believe I had the right to stop. You showed me that belief was constructed on a faulty premise. I have been examining every other premise I have been operating on since then, and they do not hold up any better." He paused. "I know my own mind, Martha. I have known it since the first afternoon in your garden, and I have been sitting with it for long enough to be certain it is not a reaction to anything temporary." Another pause. "Also, you saved my life, which I find I am not inclined to treat casually." She stood up and walked around the table and looked down at him for a moment with those eyes that saw everything, and then she sat in the chair beside him, very close, and said, "Yes." He reached up with his good hand and touched her face, and she turned her head slightly into the touch with the expression of someone allowing themselves something they have been carefully managing for a long time, and it was perhaps the most intimate thing he had ever witnessed, that conscious allowance. They married in December, in the small church of uncertain denomination on Redemption's Main Street, with Prout as witness and Cassius Webb as the other, and half the town turning out despite the cold, because people were genuinely glad about it in the simple way that communities are glad when two people who fit together well are seen to come together. Doc Hennessy attended and gave Calvin a direct, honest look at the reception afterward that contained both an acknowledgment of Martha's extraordinary capability and the kind of professional respect that comes hard to men of his training, and Calvin received it with the simplicity it deserved. They celebrated modestly, in the way of people who valued substance over display, with food Martha had prepared over 3 days, with music from a fiddle player who played for 2 hours with great joy and moderate technique, and with conversation that went long into the cold December night. Calvin did not leave his deputy position immediately. He and Prout had an agreement to see the Holt trial through, and the trial, when it came in the spring of 1879, produced a conviction on the fraud charges, and a prison sentence of 3 years, which was less than Calvin had hoped for but more than Holt had anticipated. The surviving victims of his land schemes, several families who had been displaced by the false boundary maneuvers, received restitution through a territorial court order that was, given the usual pace of territorial justice, a minor miracle, and Martha had played a significant role in it by documenting her own experience systematically and helping 2 other affected parties organize their evidence. In the spring, Calvin took over management of the small ranch property adjacent to Martha's land, a parcel that had become available when its previous owner departed the territory. It was 40 acres, enough to run a small herd and to grow feed crops, and between it and Martha's 15 acres, they had a piece of land that was, by their combined estimation, exactly right for the life they were building. Calvin proved a capable rancher, the son of Ohio farmland remembering more than he had expected, and Martha's knowledge of the soil and water management made the combined operation significantly more productive than the sum of its parts. The garden expanded in its second year, growing into a portion of the ranch property where the soil and exposure were favorable, and what had been Martha's private operation became something that served the whole community more formally. She had always prepared remedies for anyone who came to her, but with more land and Calvin's labor supporting the operation, she was able to grow more of the harder-to-source plants, the ones she had previously had to travel far to collect, and to produce her preparations in quantities that made them more reliably available. Doc Hennessy, to his credit, swallowed his professional pride sufficiently to enter into a genuine working relationship with her by the summer of 1879, each bringing the other cases that fell better under the other's expertise, and the health outcomes in redemption and its surroundings showed the improvement that combination produced. Martha kept meticulous records of everything, and the notebooks she accumulated through these years were, though no one would have used the word yet, a clinical record of a practice that was both more rigorous and more effective than most of what was happening in formally trained medicine in the territory. On a warm evening in June of 1879, sitting on the step of their house with the garden dark and fragrant in the summer dusk, Calvin told Martha that he was entirely happy. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his, and was quiet for a moment. "That is a large claim," she said. "I am known for accuracy," he said. She made a small sound that was entirely a laugh, which was rare enough to be valuable. "I have been considering something," she said. "Tell me." "The notebooks," she said. "My grandmother's and mine. They represent something that should be more widely available. Not just for the people who can come to me directly, but for people in places without any reliable medical resource at all, which is most of this territory and most of the territories beyond it. I have been thinking about the possibility of finding a way to have them printed and distributed." She was quiet for a moment. "It would require some financial investment and some connections I do not currently have, and it would require someone who understands both the organizational side of such an effort and the kind of people you need to speak to in order to make it happen." Calvin sat beside her in the dusk, looking at the garden, thinking about this. "I know some people in Prescott," he said. "And I have contacts in Flagstaff from my time coming through. There is a printer in Prescott who does good work. You would be willing to manage that part of it," she said. "I would be honored to manage that part of it," he said, and meant it completely. In August, Martha told him quietly one morning that she was pregnant. Calvin was silent for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "All right." She looked at him with those assessing eyes. "I mean," he said, with the specific tenderness he was still learning to let out of himself, the tenderness that she had made room for by simply being who she was, "that I am so glad." He took her hands. "I am so glad." They were both careful people who had come to happiness by a route that required them to be careful. And in the 9 months that followed, they were careful in the best possible way, present and attentive and honest with each other about the fears and the joy in equal measure. Martha continued her work through the pregnancy with characteristic determination, modified only in the ways she determined were medically necessary. And Calvin's protectiveness expressed itself not in restriction but in support, in doing more of the physical work of the ranch and the garden, in being available and present without requiring her to diminish herself in any way. Their son was born in March of 1880, a Monday morning with a clear, cold sky outside the window, and the garden just beginning to show the first green of the new season. Doc Hennessy attended, and Martha, who had delivered other women's babies in various circumstances but was encountering this particular circumstance from an entirely different angle, was more honest in the aftermath about the difficulty of it than Calvin had expected, which he respected as being exactly in keeping with who she was. She did not minimize the reality. She simply moved through it. They named him James Monroe Donnelly, James for Calvin's father, Monroe for the name she had built and carried and would not relinquish. Cassius Webb came to see the baby and said the boy had Calvin's jaw and Martha's eyes, which they both thought was precisely right. Prout came and held the baby with a careful, large-handed tenderness and said it was the best thing that had happened in redemption in his tenure as marshal. The notebooks were printed in the autumn of 1880, a project Calvin had managed through 6 months of correspondence and 2 trips to Prescott, resulting in a practical herbal guide of 230 pages that drew on 3 generations of accumulated knowledge and Martha's own rigorously documented records. It was dedicated, in Martha's precise handwriting, to her grandmother, and in the dedication she wrote the woman's full name and the name of the village in Georgia where she had been born and from which she had been driven, because the record deserved that truth in it. The guide was distributed through the territorial network, through trading posts and general stores, and the offices of county doctors from Arizona to New Mexico Territory, and the response over the following year was an accumulating evidence of its value. Letters arriving at the Monroe Donnelly property from people Calvin had never heard of, reporting specific cases where the guide had provided a remedy when nothing else was available, recording specific recoveries, asking specific questions that Martha answered in her notebook and incorporated into the second edition she was already planning. Calvin read these letters to her in the evenings, sitting in the same chairs by the same window where they had spent so many evenings in the years before, while James slept in the room that had been Calvin's spare room when he first came to the house as a wounded man on borrowed time. Listening to what she had built reach out across the territory and touch lives she would never directly encounter, he felt the pride again, that deep and particular pride, but layered now with years of knowing her, with the specific knowledge of what it cost to build something this real. By the spring of 1881, the ranch was fully established, running 60 head of cattle and producing enough feed crops to be nearly self-sufficient. Calvin had added a proper barn and a separate outbuilding for Martha's preparation work, a clean, light-filled space with shelves for her jars and a large work table and a window that looked out onto the expanded garden. It was the best workspace she had ever had, and the morning he showed it to her completed, before any of her things were moved into it, she had stood in the doorway looking at it for a long moment with an expression that he had learned over 3 years to read as the particular expression of being deeply moved while managing the fact of being deeply moved. She had turned to him and said, "This is a very good thing you have done." He had said, "I have been learning from an excellent teacher." She had stepped close to him and put her arms around him with the straightforward, undecorated affection that was her way, and he had held her in the doorway of the new building with the spring light around them, and felt the particular completeness that comes when a man has finally understood what his life is for. In the summer of 1882, Martha told him she was pregnant again. This time he said, "Good," immediately, and she laughed, the full laugh she gave rarely, and that was always a gift. James was 2 years old by then and had the beginnings of his mother's focused, observational nature, alongside what Martha described as Calvin's constitutional stubbornness, which she said this without criticism, and with the particular fondness that suggested she found the stubbornness not entirely unwelcome. He spent hours in the garden following Martha at a short distance, watching what she did with the plants, and had already begun attempting to replicate her careful examination of leaves and stems in his own small-handed, 2-year-old way. Calvin watched this and felt something that was not complicated and was not mixed with anything difficult. It was pure. Their daughter was born in February of 1883, in a snowstorm that was unusual for the Arizona Territory but not unheard of, and she arrived with considerably more speed and impatience than her brother had, which Martha said with a tired and loving smile was a personal style she intended to watch for. They named her Alice, for Martha's mother, and Clara for the grandmother whose knowledge had started everything, and Calvin held the baby in the morning light of the day after the snow, and understood with a finality that left no room for qualification that this was his life, this specific, improbable, hard-earned, extraordinary life, and that he had received it from the hands of a woman who had pulled him out of the red dirt when he was certain he was finished and had given him, through her knowledge and her certainty and her fierce, extraordinary self, the means to go on. Redemption grew in those years, as the railroad extension brought more people and more commerce to the region, and the town that had been provisional and raw when Calvin rode in on a trail-weary horse in 1878 became something more settled and more substantial. New buildings went up and businesses established themselves and families arrived, and with the arrival of families came, inevitably, the demand for everything that families need. Martha's practice grew with the town, and by the mid-1880s, she was seeing patients 3 days a week in the outbuilding that had become a proper consultation space, with her second edition guide on the wall and the originals of her grandmother's notebooks in a cedar chest she had built for the purpose, safe from damp and insects and the indifference of time. Doc Hennessy retired in 1884, and the new doctor who replaced him was a young woman named Frances Aldrich, who had trained in St. Louis and who arrived in Redemption with a medical bag and a copy of Martha's Guide, which she had acquired in New Mexico, and which she said had prepared her for the specific conditions of the territory better than anything she had encountered in her formal training. She and Martha became colleagues and then friends, and the combination of their practices, each drawing on what the other's training provided, produced for Redemption and the surrounding communities a quality of medical care that was, by any measure, remarkable. Calvin continued working with Marshal Prout through the early 1880s, though his role shifted over time as the territory's law enforcement became more formally organized, and the kind of individual, discretionary work that a frontier deputy did became less necessary. By 1884, he had formally left the position and was working full-time on the ranch, which under his management had grown to 120 head of cattle and had become one of the more respected small operations in the region. He was known as a man of absolute reliability and uncommon fairness, someone who dealt straight with his neighbors and who had a particular quality of calm authority that diffused situations that might otherwise have become confrontations. People who knew the story of the ambush and his recovery knew that the calm was not untested. People who knew Calvin himself understood that the calm had a source, not in distance or in the suppression of feeling, but in the having arrived of a man who had found what he was looking for and knew it and was not moving on. James Monroe Donnelly grew into a boy, and then a young man with his mother's eyes and her analytical mind, and his father's physical steadiness, and his father's capacity for loyalty. He helped in the garden from the time he could work, learned the names of the plants and their purposes, and by the time he was 12 had begun contributing his own observations to the family notebooks in a handwriting that combined elements of both his parents' scripts. Alice Clara Donnelly was, from early on, her own particular force, with a stubbornness and a warmth that her parents recognized in each other and found both exhausting and wonderful. And she had a specific gift for the animals of the ranch, an instinct for their health and behavior that was the ranching equivalent of her mother's gift for plants. In the autumn of 1885, on an evening in October when the light was the same amber and shadow quality it had been on the evening when Calvin had first sat in Martha's garden as a recovering wounded man and begun to understand what was happening to him, they sat together on the step of the house that had been hers alone and was now undeniably theirs, and watched the children play at the far end of the garden. "You remember what you asked me the first week," Calvin said. Martha looked at him. "You will need to be more specific. I asked you many things that week." "You asked if I was certain," he said, "about staying." She was quiet, watching the children. "I want to report," he said, "that I remained certain, in case the record was incomplete." She turned to look at him, and in her face was the full warmth she no longer managed or contained, the warmth that had grown through years of building something real together, through the hard work and the ordinary days and the specific, irreplaceable nights when they lay in the dark and talked with the honesty that two people develop when they have committed to seeing each other truly. "The record is noted," she said. He put his arm around her, careful of nothing now. The shoulder healed to nothing but a scar that ached occasionally in cold weather, and she settled against him with the ease of long practice, her head fitting in the hollow of his shoulder as though it had always been designed for exactly that. In the garden, James was explaining something to Alice with his mother's particular gesture of focused illustration, one hand describing a shape in the air while the other held a plant stem. Alice was, with equal characteristic precision, ignoring the explanation and examining the plant herself, which was, all things considered, exactly right. The sun went down behind the San Francisco peaks in a long banner of red and gold and purple, and the garden filled with the particular evening scent of the high desert, sage and dust, and the sweetness of the late-blooming plants that Martha had selected for exactly this quality. And Calvin Donnelly, who had ridden into this piece of the world on a trail-worn horse with a stone in his chest, and a dark past behind him and no particular future ahead of him, held his wife in the soft autumn dark and understood with the full weight of all his living that the finest thing that had ever happened to him had begun with the certain knowledge that he was finished. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong in the best possible way. And the woman who had corrected him with her hands and her knowledge and the fierce, extraordinary intelligence that had never once been less than fully itself, sat beside him now in the light that was fading and the night that was coming. And she was, to his complete and permanent conviction, worth every moment of the road that had led him here. Somewhere in the cedar chest in the consultation room were the notebooks, his grandmother's and Martha's own, the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of women who had refused to let what they knew be lost. And in the shelf beside them were the printed editions, the copies that had gone out into the territory and the territories beyond, carrying that knowledge into hands that needed it, into moments that were perhaps, in their own way, as desperate as the moment in the red dirt of the dry creek bed when a man had been certain he was finished, and a woman had crouched over him in the late sun and said, with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were about, that he was going to live. He had lived. He had done considerably more than live. Martha turned her face up to the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above the garden, and Calvin watched her watch them, and between them was the quiet that is only possible between two people who have learned each other all the way to the bone and have found, in the full knowing of the other, not diminishment but the deep and sustaining satisfaction of being truly known. "The second edition," she said. "I have been thinking about the section on wound care. There are 3 preparations I have developed since the first printing that should be included. I will write to the printer in Prescott," he said. "The dedication stays the same," she said. "Always," he agreed. The stars came out over the Arizona territory, over the ranch and the garden and the house that was solid and real and built to last, And the night came down gentle and clear and full of the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that matters. And in the morning they would rise and work, and the children would be loud, and the cattle would require attention, and the garden would have its own demands, and there would be letters to answer and preparations to make, and all the ordinary, irreplaceable business of a life fully lived. But for now, the step, and the stars, and the certainty that had replaced the other certainty, the warm, living, permanent certainty of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was supposed to be with, in the life that a woman with dark eyes and sure hands and a canvas bag full of remedies had given back to him in the red dirt of a dry creek bed on a September afternoon in 1878, when he had been absolutely sure he was finished. And she had been absolutely sure he was not. She had been right. She was almost always right. He had learned to accept this with gratitude, which was, of all the things she had taught him, perhaps the most valuable lesson of all.